Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm delighted to have three folks here who know considerably more about the American Rescue Plan Act than I know, and are willing to give their wisdom and experience to the nonprofit sector this afternoon. So I want to introduce Jason Riddle, who is currently the Deputy Director of Montana Association of Counties, or MACO. Jason's also on the board of the Montana Economic Developers Association. He was past board chair of the Montana Nonprofit Association. So a good friend, and Jason, really appreciate your being with us. Bridget Wilkinson is a good friend also. We've been working together a long time, communicating about different events, sharing the energy that comes from Gallatin County. She's done a great job sharing that with others who are in leadership across the state in the nonprofit sector through our networks. And Bridget is the executive director of One Valley Community Foundation. So glad you're here. And then Tanya Andreasen is the director of community engagement at One Valley Community Foundation, also has a background in local government. And so we'll be contributing some of that to the conversation. I think that we will take questions toward the end. If there's something, that comes up that's directly related to what's going to the conversation at hand, we will handle those questions in the moment. And then I know there were some other questions folks had, and some are very specific and may be better answered via email or individually by Jason or Bridget or Tanya, and we'll just handle it that way. And I think with that, it is being recorded. And so really appreciate y'all being here. And Jason and Bridget and Tanya, thank you so much. And Jason, I think we'll start with you. If you can just talk with us about your role with ARPA and your role with the commissioners, and then I know you're kind of ready to roll.
Thanks, Liz. I'd like to start by thanking all of you for getting on here. Having come from the nonprofit world and specifically the economic development world, I know what it's like to try and find funds for your particular causes and missions. It's not easy. And so hopefully today helps. I'd like to go through a brief overview of ARPA, both the federal direct funds that counties got, and then talk a little bit about the state allocation, which some of that has been set aside for counties as well. And then talk about how I would recommend you approach different county commissioners. And please know that all 56 are different. Some may have formal processes for you to make an ask. And I think Gallatin County has some examples of that. And then some may not have any sort of process, and you might just have to give them a call and get on an agenda and go have a conversation with them. So hopefully this is helpful. With that, we'll just jump in. So the original interim rule had 4 eligibility categories. The primary one for nonprofits was the public health and economic response category. That's where nonprofits would fit. The others were premium pay for essential workers, which was in essence giving additional wages to those folks that had to work through the pandemic to keep society running and protect us. The third was water, sewer, and broadband. Water, sewer, and broadband is important because the state of Montana took a portion of their funds that they got and allocated it to local governments for water, sewer, and broadband. So when you hear about the state's legislation that set aside funds for local governments, that's the category that they specified. They didn't open it up to the other 3 eligible categories. And so most of those dollars are going to end up going to water and sewer projects, just by the way the legislation was crafted. And then the last category, which became very important when the final rule was issued, is lost revenue. So if a local government lost revenue during the pandemic, they could complete a formula-driven calculation, and if they could show lost revenue, they could claim it. That changed with the final rule. And we'll get into the details of the impacts of that, but it significantly changed how we can use the money. So under number one, which is where I believe most nonprofits would claim eligibility, that's under page 14. And I believe Shelby will send you the document that has the guidance. Page 14 of the Treasury Final Rule Introduction shows how nonprofits can claim eligibility through number one. Decreased revenue, financial insecurity, increased costs are some of the things. Some nonprofits are automatically eligible if you're in a qualified census tract, if you're operated by a tribal government or on tribal lands, you're automatically eligible. So that's where the nonprofits would fit. And under the interim rule, that's where I would have sent you to specifically look up the rules before you approach the county commissioners. That all changed, or at least it changed for 50 of our 56 counties when the final rule came out, because under lost revenue, instead of having to prove it through the formula, you have options. You can either still prove it through the formula, or you can claim your allocation up to $10 million as basically automatically lost revenue. So the wording they're using is a standard allowance. 50 of our 56 counties got less than $10 million. By claiming the standard allowance, they can use those funds for any governmental expenditure, any allowed governmental expenditure, which means roads and bridges are opened up for counties. It means that anything under Title VII for nonprofits that are eligible is on the books now. So most of your counties, with the exception of the big six, are going to claim that $10 million as lost revenue. And so that changed the game. And the way that changed the game is now we look at Title VII for what is allowed under general governmental purposes for counties. And 53 of our 56 counties are general government, have general government powers. And that means that if it's not specified or implied in law, then we cannot do it. There are 3 that are self-governed, which means they can do anything as long as it's not excluded. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll just go with the general powers. So what's allowed or implied? Our general playbook is in 7/6/25/27, which will also be sent out to you. And it has a laundry list of different eligible uses or governmental purposes that counties can do that most nonprofits are going to fall in. For example, transportation for senior citizens and persons with disabilities, port authorities. I think I saw a port authority person on the list, recreation, educational, other activities, parks and cultural facilities, museums, public health, developmental disabilities, mental health services, indigent assistance, economic development. So you can see that most all of you are probably going to fall in one of those categories under Title VII, Chapter 6, but you'll want to look those up and make sure that when you approach the county commissioners, you know where you would fall so that they know that you are an eligible governmental expenditure under the general powers. So even though we have a lot of more flexibility as counties for those dollars, in essence, it also opened up competition for you. So when you approach your county commissioners, you're not only competing with the other nonprofits and the cities and towns within your district, within your county for the funds, because water and sewer was eligible. You're now competing with their roads and bridges and other general governmental expenses that they pay out of their own budget on a regular basis. And obviously, most of them are under tight budgets. So before you go in and give your pitch, I would recommend a few things. I would make sure you know how much money they're going to get. And Shelby will send out the list of all the counties and their direct funds. If you're an economic developer and you're working for a city or town, you'll want to know how much the set aside was at the state level. If you're not doing water or sewer, you basically can ignore the state pot of money and only look at the direct funds. So understand the amount of funds available from ARPA to your county. and sort of where you stand and how much of that bucket you're going to use, knowing that they have other important uses for those dollars as well. Know where you fit in the criteria for both the state statutory ability and the ARPA. So you can make two arguments. Most of you will probably fit in both of those buckets. I would make the argument on both sides. The nice thing about the lost revenue is it limits our audit compliance risk considerably, which is why we're recommending the counties go that way. If we use the other three pots, then they come in and they audit the expenditures. If we're within the $10 million, they're just assuming we did it right. And as long as we don't spend it for something that's illegal, we're good. And so that audit risk mitigation is really important. But if you can say, hey, we fit under ARPA generally, but we also fit under the MCA guidelines, and we understand you want to use lost revenue. So here's how you can argue that we're a good fit both ways. Know how your use of the funds is going to mitigate the pandemic. One of the things throughout the guidance, if a county is going to give funds to another entity, I think politically and locally, they will want us be able to say, here's why we gave it and here's how it helped in our community's response to the pandemic. When you talk to commissioners, make sure you talk about the rural area in your county and how your project impacts them. A lot of times the focus will be on the urban center. The cities and towns got some money too. And what you don't want to do is go in and make the ask and talk about all the impacts to this town of Big Timber or the town of Terry. And then the commissioners say, well, then go talk to the town. So make sure you've got your argument in place for why it's good for the entire county, knowing that both are within both our constituents, but I would make sure that you keep in mind the rural folks. How are you leveraging your funds? Is your ask simply for a pot of money from the county through their ARPA funds and that's it? Or are you leveraging additional dollars? The further the money stretches, the better and easier it is to sell. And then how are you going to communicate with them? How are you going to tell the commissioners whether you're succeeding, what your benchmarks are, what does success look like in the end, so that when they get asked why they gave you money or how it's going with your project, they know and they don't have to reach out to you. So, what are the measurables? What are you going to give them to show them that what you said you were going to do, you're doing, and that what success looks like. That's it in a nutshell for how I would approach it. Make sure you meet the state statutory regs and or the federal. Know how much you're asking for, know how much that is of the pot. Reach out to the commissioners and go have a conversation with them.
Jason, thank you. And Shelby put in the chat the federal guidance, the final guidance that you referred to. She also put the state information in on counties, and she included the allocation that each county received. And Jason, I'm going to ask the question I asked you earlier. That amount in that table for per county is how much your county is getting over the whole time of ARPA. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
All but one have, to my knowledge, all but one have received or requested their first half.
Okay.
So, odds are a good number of those have allocated that first half of dollars already. Not all though, but if they have, they're going to be asking for the other half this next fall. So, just because we're into this a ways and they may have obligated their first half of their money doesn't mean they've obligated the second half of their money, and you still have that opportunity.
Okay. And then what's the time frame for the funds to be expended?
They have 5 years.
Okay. So that's from 21.
Yeah. So 26, I think, is obligated.
Okay. Obligated. Okay.
I know that off the top of my head, but I don't know.
Okay. If your organization is located in one county, physically located, but you are a statewide organization, do you work with each of the commissioners in the various counties where you have service? Do you have a recommendation there?
Boy, there is an allowance. So if they take the lost revenue and you fit within the Title VII and you're delivering services within that county, I think you could approach each county with a separate ask. But I would be ready to show that you're going to expend, if you ask Gallatin County for $20,000, that you would expend those resources in Gallatin County based on that. If you're going to do it over multiple counties, then you need to show the benefit to the multiple counties.
Okay.
So the example that comes to mind, it's not a great one for this group, is a regional water system. It benefits multiple areas, but some of that is going to be your county as well.
Right. One other question is will there be training at the MACO conference for commissioners so that or would you be open to training so that they know they can use the funds in these ways? Or I know we sent a letter early on, but it was one of a million letters. Do they have training in knowing what the eligibility is, or do they learn case by case as people ask them?
So thank you, my friend Sarah. We repeatedly send out guidance. We have really pushed the guidance on the lost revenue piece because we think that gives the greatest flexibility to the commissioners. We will beat it every time we have a mic at our midwinter, that they need to make sure that they categorize all their expenditures on ARPA under lost revenue, and that yes, there are and a good number of things that they can use those dollars for. Telling them does not always make them hear. Right.
Is your sense, Jason, and then we're going to turn to One Valley, but is your sense that counties early on they were looking for ways to spend the money. Is your sense that they're still kind of scrambling, or do they kind of have many, many ideas on how to spend it now?
So up until the final rule, our counties were either giving it to municipalities, or in some instances, some nonprofits, and especially in the more urban areas, because they couldn't find a way to spend it under those categories. Some of them, and even some of the more conservative areas, were considering premium pay, which politically was a little tough for them, but they were having a hard time figuring out how to get the money out the door. That all changed with the $10 million in lost revenue and the opening to any governmental purposes. The second they made it so that we could do roads and bridges, in essence, the problem with getting the money allocated went away, because we have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of road and bridge projects statewide.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. So One Valley is an example. One Valley Community Foundation is an example of an organization that was able to work or partner with their county in order to receive funding for a specific project. And let's see, I think what I'd like to do is Bridget, if you could talk about what the project was, and then Tanya will talk about how the process worked, and then go back to Bridget for how the project will eventually make its way into the community. So Bridget, if you could tell us what the project was.
Sure, happy to do that. It's great to be with everyone today. Thanks so much. Once again, I'm Bridget Wilkinson, President and CEO of the One Valley Community Foundation. Really briefly, I actually think this context is helpful for those that might not work with their local community foundation or know what a community foundation does. I actually think the context of understanding kind of the animal that is a community foundation might be useful. So I want to briefly talk about who One Valley is, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming grant cycle opportunity that we have with Gallatin County, with our local county government. So really briefly, at the One Valley Community Foundation, we believe in the power power of all people to make a difference in their communities. And we really celebrate what makes communities throughout Gallatin County unique. And so we work every day with donors and remarkable organizations like you all to chart a course for a healthy and vibrant future. So that's really important to us to bring people together and to help support our community really in 4 specific ways. So the first is to partner with a growing number of donors to establish funds on their behalf to support charitable causes like yours and organizations that are doing really important things. So that's really the first bucket of work that we are in. Today we manage 47 distinct funds, and that adds up to about 46 million of funding for our local communities that we're trying to get out the door. Secondly, we strengthen our community's nonprofit sector by providing training and leadership development programs, sometimes in partnership with MNA, with our friends there, that help your organizations better deliver on your mission. Third, we multiply the impact of grassroots generosity for the benefit of a growing number of local organizations. An example of that is our annual Giving Day that's going to happen in May. And then lastly, our goal is to address our community's most pressing challenges by convening critical conversations and engaging diverse stakeholders in innovative ways. A good example of that is our recent countywide community conversation initiative called A Seat at the Table that really focused on housing. So I say all of that because as a community foundation or your local community foundation in whatever community that you are serving, plays kind of a unique role of being an even-handed convener and, for lack of better words, almost like a Switzerland of your area. And so we approached the county, and I'll let Tanya talk a little bit more about the process of this, but we approached our county to say, can we co-create a grant-making process together? We know that you have these ARPA funds. We really want to advocate that some of that funding go to support our local nonprofit sector that's been impacted by COVID-19 throughout Gallatin County. And as a community foundation, we already have an existing grant-making process and grant-making tools and software that we can actually facilitate the process and the internal infrastructure for it. Additionally, we have relationships with organizations large and small that you may have never heard of, Gallatin County government, and we'd love to elevate some of those organizations that you might not know of that could really benefit from this funding. So that was part of our approach. And like I said, I'll let Tanya explore a little bit more about that. But I want to be very transparent that we really believe in co-creating this process with Gallatin County. So we are in the middle of that right now. As a community foundation, we typically practice trust-based philanthropy, which means that we want to trust the organizations that we support. And so we try to reduce a lot of barriers for funding at the community foundation. And so I will say that right now, the puzzle we're trying to balance is that trust-based philanthropy model alongside the government regulations and reporting regulations that maybe are less trust-based and require quite a bit of information. And so we're trying to figure out that balance internally right now. Additionally, we're trying not to reinvent the wheel completely. There are some community foundations across the US that are partnering with their local city or county governments to help allocate these funds. And so we're looking at their grant guidelines and application process as well to see if we can glean any wisdom from our peers about this process. So I say all of that because we don't have it fully fleshed out right now. We're learning from our peers. We're trying to understand that balance. But our hope is that our grant guidelines and our application will be open by the end of March. So that will require some co-creation time with our county, but that's really the goal. So I say that because this process is a little bit outside of the norm for us in terms of how we allocate funding. But currently, our goal is really to grant to nonprofit organizations within Gallatin County to ensure their ongoing resiliency and efficacy as employers and providers of economic and social services and programming to community members in Gallatin County. And so I think our hope is really understanding what COVID-19 might have exposed as organizational weaknesses for you, for us to help you build some organizational resiliency. So let me give you an example. I remember this even as an employer, that when COVID-19 in March 2020 came out of the woodwork, I remember thinking, can we go fully virtual? Can my team go fully remote? Do we have the systems and processes to be able to do this? So an example of a potential grant from this $500,000 in funding could be that during COVID-19, you realize that your accounting system was just paper and pen, or was archaic and had a lot of hard files. And so it wasn't easy to transition to working remotely when everything shut down. And so you're interested in transitioning your organization to maybe a cloud-based accounting service or system. So that's an example of helping to kind of build some organizational resiliency. Additionally, another example would be that maybe your staff is feeling a sense of burnout. Maybe the work that you are doing is really exhausting your team, and you all haven't had a lot of training in that self-care and resiliency as a staff. So being able to invest in that, that maybe you didn't realize was an issue prior to COVID-19, and now upon reflection could be an area of growth and opportunity for your organization. So really, this funding we're viewing as created for nonprofit operations and special projects, so that you as nonprofits can continue to be good employers in Gallatin County and deliver on your services.
And Bridget, just a question, maybe you said this and I missed it. You received basically an award amount of 500,000 that you'll be regranting. Is that right?
Yeah. So I apologize. Yeah. Tanya was going to talk a little bit about the details of the actual process, but yes, we received $500,000 in funding from Gallatin County that we will then be allocating through this grant cycle. A key piece of that, though, is that the county commissioners ultimately have the decision-making authority about how those funds are going to be allocated. So while we'll run the grants process, we'll have a committee that will help review these applications to be able to seek community input. Ultimately, the commissioners will decide how that funding will be allocated.
Sure. And maybe you said the amount. I might have been listening to some other details. So
no worries.
I think what's important for people to know listening is that this is an example of a successful partnership that is still being created. But and I think Tanya then will talk about how it worked. Yeah. And then Bridget, I'd like to come back to you.
That sounds great. And actually, this is a good time to transition to Tanya, and then I will field additional questions.
Yeah. Okay. Tanya.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for your time. Essentially, my job is to tell you the story, kind of a case study of our approach and partnership with our county commissioners here in Gallatin County. So as Jason said, there have been some changes even since we first started discussing the ARPA funds with the county administrators and commissioners back in June. So the way that our county decided to structure their decision-making around these funds is based on them saying out loud and honestly, oh, wow, $22 million is a lot of money. We don't really know what to do with it. We want it to be impactful. We want to make generational change. We can't possibly know all of the needs and outcomes of the pandemic that are out there around the county. So we're going to host listening sessions. And so because our commissioners had the, foresight and latitude to host these listening sessions, we hustled and put together a pitch, a proposal. And as Jason listed some of his recommendations to you, I'm actually kind of proud that we managed to do some of those things. The final rule wasn't out yet, but we read the interim federal treasury guidance. We reached out to other community foundations and governments, including the city of Bozeman, that had done some allocation of pandemic funding. We tried to educate ourselves as much as possible about what the county's sort of funding priorities were and maybe other gaps that they were considering. We asked a lot of questions. We relied on our existing relationships with them and with staff and with other nonprofits and private partners around the county. So in order to position our pitch or our proposal as, in the best light possible, we wanted to make sure it met their needs. We wanted to convey the needs of the community that we were intending to meet with our proposal. And we wanted to tell them how we were going to get the job done, why we were the best people to do it, and how we were going to get it done, and how we were going to measure its success. So I got to tell you, the first proposal we gave them, they were not very interested in it. We've got quite a housing problem here in Gallatin County, and we have a major issue with underhoused and unhoused people that didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago. We have families bunking up. We have families losing their homes and moving away. We have individual young professionals, seniors, even my own high school kids who know that they can't age in place or start their careers or start families here in Gallatin County. The median sales price for a single family home is well above $700,000. And if your household makes $50 or $70 or even $100,000 a year, you're not going to be able to afford that home. So we have a big problem on our hands, and our proposal to them initially was around housing. We proposed that they fund a project of One Valley, so give money to, not through, One Valley to do some housing work, to stand up a fund, to do some grant making, but also to fund me, to do some work around housing. So just as you are thinking about your potential proposal for this funding or other funding, I mean, we had organizational and programmatic needs that we were pitching them for. And through a couple of meetings, we suggested that they not only give to One Valley for our needs as a nonprofit and a community foundation, but also through us, because we know nonprofits. We know the smaller localities and unincorporated areas around our county. And we have our ear to the ground for what those needs are. And in the end, the reason we're here today is not because they decided to give to us to fund our programs and our service delivery, sort of, but to give through us. They wanted to bolster nonprofits as employers and as the folks who are actually doing the service delivery to our underrepresented and populations in need around the county. So we're well positioned to do both, but I just want to be clear that they didn't fund us programmatically. They are in another scenario, it would be sort of fee for service work. We are offering our expertise, our relationships, our connections, our time, even our software to do very effective and decentralized grant making to our nonprofit sector here in the county. A note about the 10 million final rule that Jason mentioned. As I said, the county received or will receive with its second tranche of funding $22 million. That's a heck of a lot of money, and that's never happened, at least in anybody's memory that I've talked to, money of that magnitude. And so as we were in discussions over the weeks and months last summer and even into the fall, we were thinking that the county had $22 million to expend. And so our proposal initially was that they put $10 million in a housing solutions fund. It's a big problem and needs some big money, and we asked them to invest in it. So we kind of went big and did end up with nothing so far. But what has changed drastically is that with that final rule that Jason mentioned, our county government can now use that for purposes that they generally expend money on. And Jason's example, I think, were roads and bridges, right? Well, they have a courthouse to build, and the bids are very expensive. So I don't know where they've landed on this decision, but my understanding is that, oh my gosh, what a relief. Now we could use up to $10 million of those, of the 22, to go towards a county need, an infrastructure need like a courthouse. Did I speak out of class, Jason? You just turned your camera back on. I just want to make sure that I'm giving an example of what that interim rule, final rule meant for the 10 million.
You're spot on.
Okay. So now instead of 22 million, we might be looking at 12 million. I don't know what their decision making is, but it does narrow it down a little bit. So back to the process, the county decided we want to expend money to assist with housing, nonprofit sort of recovery, economic vitality, essentially, of our nonprofit sector, broadband, and oh my goodness, behavioral health, mental health. And so they identified from these listening sessions and from, you know, other data sources, about 5 buckets that they wanted to fund with whatever, let's say 12 million, just because we're subtracting off that 10. And again, that's me guessing, that's not real. So essentially, in I think our third pitch, Bridget, we said to them, you know, please consider giving to us. We have these different ways that we think that we could be a good partner to the county, and meet some of the needs in those buckets that you've identified. But remember also that we would be happy to help with some grant making to the nonprofit sector and leverage our relationships and our existing systems. And in the end, they took us up on that. So in December, I believe, we had a meeting with them where they outlined a contract with us for $500,000. And the way that the contract is phrased is that it is economic recovery of that sector of our economy. So one sector of our economy, of course, is nonprofits. And so the 500,000 that we've been granted is meant to re-grant. We'll use a portion of those funds as an administrative fee, but the rest we will grant out to our nonprofit sector for economic recovery. Jono, I'm reading, have all counties identified their top line priorities as Gallatin County? Boy, I am not the right person to ask that question. I have to give big snaps and kudos to our commissioners because they did not need to do that. There's nothing that's required them to do that, to be so thoughtful and contemplative. But they have done that. And I feel like that's really what has gotten us to the point where we're at today. Does anybody have any other questions so far? I have like 2 more things to say and then I'll toss it over to Bridget.
I'd like to respond to Jono really quickly, and I think Jason can probably do a good job of that. I think all the commissioners are in different places. What I would say that Tanya is highlighting is that there is capacity for anyone to go to the commissioners and represent the county needs and to ask if there's a process, you know, respectfully ask. But so that's an opportunity for everyone. But to my understanding, many counties, well, some counties are getting a very, very small amount, but my understanding is that many counties don't have that kind of strategic lens. Jason?
Yeah, that's correct. You know, a general rule is the bigger the county, probably the more formal and more sophisticated they are in taking requests and or analyzing priorities. We're talking about a range of money from, you know, $31 million in Yellowstone County down to 95 grand in Petroleum. So, you know, Petroleum County having an actual formal process, not likely. But it's an awful small community and they know what nonprofits they might have or not have. They know what community needs they have. They were struggling with multiple things related to ambulances during cares and things. So I know that they've thought through what they need as a community, but whether or not they've made formal decisions, I doubt it. And I know that they don't have a formal process. So the process with the smaller counties is going to be reach out to them and start a conversation sooner rather than later. Discuss with them why your project's important and what the impacts are going to be, and convince them that it's more important than a culvert. I mean, that's what it's going to boil down to. And then, the Gallatins and Yellowstones and Cascades of the world probably going to have a little bit more formal process that you'll work through. But, equally as effective given the size of the communities and the closeness of those commissioners to their constituents, given the population levels.
Thanks, Jason. Tanya, you have a couple more things.
Yeah, just really quickly, I would say, I think Bridget, myself, and there are other people, other nonprofit partners, and large employers who have engaged in these conversations with our commissioners and even our commissioners themselves. I can only speak for myself, but I would imagine that there would be willingness to share information, to reach out to other or field questions from other commissioners or nonprofits around or community foundations around the state. So please keep us in mind. Yeah. So I guess the only other thing that I would say is that I think that our proposal or our relationship with the county commissioners around these funds was made better because we reached out to other partners and were pretty transparent about how we could potentially work together. I know that there's some other nonprofits, major employers, et cetera, who have really talked about the collaborative nature of their projects and whether that's appealing or not across all counties. It was very appealing to our county commission, and I just wanted to toss that out as another factor.
And I know, thank you, Tanya. And I know, Bridget, you're going to talk a little bit about what's next, but I wonder if you would be willing to share your case study, or kind of your case statement, I guess, or some piece of that for others who are maybe considering talking about the value of, what they're doing.
Can I clarify, do you mean sort of a story of what I just told you or our original pitch to the county?
The pitch that ended up working.
Ah.
Yeah. And, 3 tries, that's persistence. Yeah.
It was a lot of work.
Yeah. If you're willing to share it, I'm sure people would be interested in seeing it. Bridget, so now what?
Yeah, I don't honestly have too much more to add. I mean, I think just keeping this more brief than not. I will say just the only other piece of this funding that I think as nonprofit organizations, it's really important to know and understand. And as a community foundation, we've committed to doing some education around this piece, is really the reporting. If you receive some of these funds, the reporting is a little bit tricky. And so I think, if you end up partnering with your county government or receiving this type of funding, I think just asking a lot of questions of what's required of you. Tanya and I are continuing to learn and explore those requirements, because basically what's required of the county is required of us, is required of our subgrantees. So that it's just a little bit different than what our normal grant making process has been. So it's requiring a lot of learning on our shoulders, but also we're wanting to be really transparent with our nonprofit organizations that end up applying and receiving this funding, what will be asked of them as well. So I just simply note that to ask questions of the entities that you might be partnering with, to make sure that you have the ability and capacity to fulfill those requirements. But overall, as a community foundation, we are an open book and we're happy to answer questions, especially if you have, your entity, your government government, city or county government that's interested in maybe this partnership, or maybe you have a local community foundation that might be able to steward a grants process on behalf of the nonprofit organizations. As Liz said, we're here to be a resource and to do some of that sharing and learning, and we'll continue to. So maybe after the ARPA funds are awarded, we're happy to share our lessons learned afterwards. So we welcome thoughts and input also from our nonprofit organizations about how you want to see these funds invested. This is a two-way dialogue. So I'll pause there. Tanya, do you have anything else you want to add about our grant cycle? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity to share this little learning and case study. And Liz, any other questions we'd welcome.
Okay.
Liz, I
Jason.
have just a quick comment. For the counties that are under the $10 million, or that claim 100% of their allocation as lost revenue, the reporting requirements should become much less stringent, because now they just have to report out that they expended it as lost revenue and that they expended it for an eligible governmental expense. And so that pass-through of subrecipient agreements that I know is complicated and burdensome, because everybody's afraid of the federal audit that could come, is somewhat relieved, or mostly relieved, in that category. It doesn't, the bigger counties that have more than 10 million that are allocating their funds on the other three categories still have those same reporting requirements for anything that goes out in those, but the smaller ones get a lot of relief from that.
Jason, a question about the process of the transparency, actually. Are counties under any kind of obligation to identify their process of identifying needs, or how they'll use the funds? Or do the funds show up on the state website, once they're expended? Like, how do people know what process counties use? Okay.
No, so the counties have to report out to the feds on how they expend the funds and under what category they're expending them.
Okay.
And so 50 of our counties, if they follow our guidance, will report out whatever amount they got under lost revenue, and they'll say they gave it to Bridget, and here's what she used it for, and those amounts, and they gave it to the road department, and they put in culverts. So they'll track their expenditures through that reporting. I don't know what Treasury will have as far as transparency of those reports. I imagine you could dig them out somehow, but if you think about the number of local governments and state governments in total reporting out on these, and the number of projects, you'd be digging in the weeds pretty deep. But I imagine they will have it. And I think if you just ask your county, the clerk probably has a running list of what they're using the money for.
That's good. Other questions? ARPA's been tough. I will say that another community foundation, the Helena Area Community Foundation, received a notice that they would be able to distribute, I think, a little over 300,000 from City of Helena. So the city can sometimes be an option. Again, every county and city got different amounts. There is also workforce development funding, and we're now in the process of developing kind of a checklist of how you can apply for that workforce development funding. And but really at the legislative session, so much of the funding was tied up, really pretty tight, and that's been hard. So it seems like there is a little bit more flexibility right now at the county and city level to some degree. And even if the flexibility isn't there, your ability to represent what nonprofits are doing and the needs of the community is really wonderful advocacy, especially right now. We need as many voices speaking that as we can get. So any other comments or questions from all of you gathered here? All right. Bridget and Tanya and Jason, we just really appreciate your being here. Congratulations on a great project. And Jason, thanks for giving us the benefit of your experience with the commissioners. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Good to see you.
Bye.